Yes, I've chosen this particular extract because it seemed so relevant to what we're dealing with right now. I mean, it's relevant all the time, but it seemed particularly sort of pertinent when we get into the material. So hopefully it'll give us a bit of a chance to talk about all this, well, just the existential nature of what it's been like to suddenly find ourselves in a pandemic. Yeah. So the story is that Milarepa has a dream. He dreams he's going to meet a heart disciple. And very soon after that dream, he meets a young man standing by a river. And the young man wakes him up. I think Milarepa's asleep by the river and says, "What are you doing here?" And Milarepa says, "Oh, I want to cross the river. Can you give me a lift on your horse?" And the young man says, "No, I'm a bit, the horse might get stressed and I don't really want to use my horse like that." And then just leaves, goes across the river himself. But when he gets to the other side, Milarepa is already there. He's managed to cross the river through his magical powers. And then the young man is overwhelmed with a sense of faith and devotion towards Milarepa. And the rest of the story is really about all the offerings that he begins to make to Milarepa out of his kind of devotion to him. Like he starts off by offering his horse, which is quite a big offering in Tibet. So he starts off by offering his horse, and then he offers him his boots and his coat and his jacket, his trousers, and then eventually he's offering him things like his vow never to kill anybody again, to hand over his weapons, that sort of thing. And gradually through the whole story, he gets deeper into relationship with Milarepa until eventually he becomes a disciple. And the story then is the beginning of his life as his disciple, as Milarepa's disciple. And he gets renamed eventually as Shiwa Ao, which is one of Milarepa's heart disciples. And he stays with Milarepa, I think, until Milarepa gets enlightened himself or passes away. Actually, maybe it's Parinirvana, I can't remember now. And just serves the Dharma for the rest of his life. So we join the story with this song where the young man has offered Milarepa his boots, and Milarepa is now singing back to him why he doesn't need the boots. And he doesn't need the boots because he's got all the protection he needs. And he's starting to use this teaching as a metaphor, the metaphor that the territory or the kind of ground that we're trying to navigate when we put our boots on is the ground of the kleshas, the mental poisons. And he says, if you work on the mental poisons, if you work with developing positivity and wisdom, then you won't need boots to manage the terrain. You've got all that you need. So we'll go into this a little bit more. And then he describes what the boots are made of, which is a very lovely bit. And I'll say a little bit about that. And what the inner resources are, what the boots are made of, what the leather is, what the stitching is, all that sort of thing. So he just gives us a quick sort of run through on what the fabric of the boots are. So in our study group, we're going to be looking at that metaphor and going through the seminar material that Bhante uses around that material. So I'm just going to read you the song. So we heard it this morning, those that were, we heard it when Sadhaloka led us in that meditation. So this is Milarepa's Song of Protection. This is what it's called in the volume on the complete works. And it's I won't go into details, right? So I'll just sing this. I'll just sing the song. That would be nice, wouldn't it? I'll have to get Dhamrati to sing the song, actually. Listen, you faithful young man. This land of darkness and blind views is part of the three kingdoms of samsara. Full of mud is craving meadow. Full of thorns is jealous swamp. Savage and malignant is the furious dog of hate. Dangerous and steep, the hill of pride. But I have crossed the rivers four and reached the shore of the Pure Land. I cut my boots from the hide of the renunciation of samsara, and with the leather of awakening from transiency and delusion, I made my boots with the craftsmanship of deep faith and karma, with the dye of non-clinging to the myriad forms, and with the thread and rope of devotion, while the clasps are the teachings of the three bindings. These are my boots, the boots of a yogi. I have no desire for yours. Yeah, so the main gist of the whole song, in fact, all the songs of the whole chapter, is that you've got this outer protection, a sort of objective offering from the man, the boots, the coat, the horse. But Milarepa is telling us this is inadequate in comparison to working with the mental poisons. It's inadequate in terms of practicing the Dharma. That's your true protection. And this is a bit of a theme through a lot of Dharma teachings. What is true protection? At the end of my presentation, Saddhaloka is going to tell us a little bit about the protection suttas from the Pali Canon. So it's a very grounded metaphor. All of us, in some way or other, are looking for protection. We tend to have quite inadequate strategies for it, which often we call false refuges. And I think during this virus time, it's sometimes thrown up quite a lot of insecurity and maybe thrown up our own inner sense of protection, the need for protection. I know that I had one episode in the last 3 months where I got very angry about something, and I realized I wanted control. I wanted control of something. And it's because I was beginning to see how little control I had. And of course, that isn't unusual. Really, we all have much less control than we think. But in this time, it seems very highlighted, very much more highlighted. So beneath a lot of our different mental states, there is this need for protection, this need for security, this need for control. And as we begin to work with our mental states, I think we begin to see that's a lot of the ground that we're standing on. So Milarepa says, well, we need to put the right boots on. We need to have the right footwear to stand on this ground. And he's using a very similar metaphor to Shantideva in the Bodhicharyavatara, as Sangharakshita says. Shantideva says, you know, if you want the world to be smooth in terms of free of hatred, you need to put on the leather, put on leather on your feet, the leather of loving kindness. Yeah. So if you cover your own mental states with positive emotion, if you see through non-clinging to ego, if you have wisdom and compassion, then it doesn't matter what the world throws at you. You can always move through that territory. So we get into some very interesting metaphorical language. Yeah, we've got this territory of the kleshas, and I'm not going to say very much about that because in the next session this afternoon, we're going to go into the kleshas more fully with another extract. But I think it's worth in the groups just looking at the metaphors. I think metaphors point us in a direction of a particular characteristic. Like, full of mud is craving meadow, or why is jealous swamp full of thorns? And just look a little bit at the metaphorical language that's being used there, because I think it points us to the direction of the nature of those mental states a little bit more. So the boots, Milarepa, Sangharakshita tells us, Bhante tells us, the boots need to be tough, not stylish and cozy. They might hurt a bit to begin with, but they will do the job. So in other words, our Dharma practice has got to be tough, not stylish or cozy. And it might hurt a bit in the beginning. It makes me think of when Bhante talked about the difference between disgruntlement and disillusionment. You know, disgruntlement is when we're not happy with our coffee, we're not happy with our chair, or we're not happy with our work. It's a certain kind of worldly, ego-based assertion of preferences. But real disillusionment is when we begin to feel kind of a heartbreak with trying to fix samsara. Real disillusionment begins to, well, it's in a way, it's a powerful impulse to change our lives. It's a powerful impulse to make a difference in our lives. It motivates us to break our habits, whereas disgruntlement keeps us entrenched in those habits. So that's a little area you could look at. You could also look at whether your Dharma practice is cozy in terms of making a smoother life for yourself, or whether it's actually a life of challenge. Yeah. Okay then, and then we get the description of what the boots are like. These boots that Milarepa has created. I cut my boots from the hide of the renunciation of samsara, and with the leather of awakening from transiency and delusion, I made my boots with the craftsmanship of deep faith in karma, with the dye of non-clinging to the myriad forms, and with the thread and rope of devotion, while the clasps are the teachings of the three bindings. These are my boots, the boots of a yogi. I have no desire for your boots. So Bante's seminar, Bante's commentary on this verse is beautiful, really beautiful. He tells us the hide of renunciation means to give up the untrustworthy protection of self-interest. The leather of awakening from transiency and delusion means to awaken to absolute insecurity. Craftsmanship of deep faith in karma means to accept our unskillful actions, to accept our unskillful actions will have unforeseen consequences. And then he tells us that all stained with non-clinging to myriad forms. In other words, the leather is dyed with non-attachment, and they're stitched with the thread of devotion, or they're laced with the laces of samaya, a bond to our ideals. So I'll say a few things about these metaphors or these images. The renunciation of self-interest. So we're giving up this quality of self-interest, which I think means giving up the idea that self-interest is the protection. That's how we function in this world, yeah? We've got to continually assert our self-interest to get the life that we want. So self-interest is what we use to protect ourselves. In the Bodhicharyavatara, Shantideva does quite a few verses around the ignorance of self-interest. Let me think, where's one? All those happy in the world are happy because of their desire for happiness of others. It's one of them. And then he says, this is Shantideva again, if one does not let go of self, one cannot let go of suffering. As one who does not let go of fire cannot let go of burning. A very, very good metaphor. So if one does not let go of self, one cannot let go of suffering. I think this can be a very helpful way of giving up self-interest, or beginning to see how one could give up self-interest. When we begin to understand what the real root of our dukkha is. You're tracing the dukkha that we experience back to the mental states that create it. I find this approach very, very effective. A lot of our pain, a lot of our dukkha has arisen because of self-referencing, self-interest, self-assertion. So You've got to train the mind to sort of find that beneath our actions, beneath the mental states that we're producing. We often hold to self-interest as a defense. We think of it as protection. But the song calls it untrustworthy protection. So it's a very interesting play on our usual perspective. So the leather of awakening, moving on to the next line, the leather of awakening from transiency and delusion. And Bhante says this is to awaken into absolute insecurity, which is quite a demand, to awaken into the absolute insecurity of life. So we've got to let go of the sleep of ignorance, the ignorance of impermanence, and wake up to the reality of this life, an absolute insecurity. When I was looking at another seminar of Bhante's, he was talking about attachment to sense desire, and he made a very interesting point. He said, it's not, let me look at it. It's not attachment to particular sensual experience that is the problem. What really happens is that we get attached to a certain pattern of life. You know, we build up a whole pattern of our lives with all the sensual experience that we have, and we think this is what life is. We assume a certain solidity in our experience, and we take it for granted that things are going to continue in that sort of way. We have a sort of assumption that what we're doing is going to continue. And he says this is really the attachment to sensual experience. So when we've got to wake up to the absolute insecurity, I've been thinking we've got to wake up to the fact that things really aren't solid in the way that we think they are. That the whole pattern of our lives could change quite dramatically. And we've certainly all seen that in the last few months. I think when we start letting go of our self-interest and going a bit further into a kind of ego clinging that usually goes on, we begin to touch a much deeper existential level, more like an existential alarm that some of those kleshas and some of those kleshas are covering. So that is often the beginning of awakening to absolute insecurity. Then the next line, deep faith in karma. And Bhante says, except our unskillful actions will have unforeseen consequences. So this is the craftsmanship of our boots, the craftsmanship, the skill of a craftsman. So the skill, the craftsmanship of a Dharma life is to understand and have deep faith in karma and accept that our unskillful actions will have unforeseen consequences. I think in the group it would be good to look at the profundity of this teaching. You know, what is it about understanding karma? What is it about really taking on that our actions have consequences that could deeply change our experience, deeply challenge our assumptions? I think most of the time we think we're going to get away with it, whatever it is, whatever we're doing, the slight sort of unethical behavior, the slight kind of irritations that we have or whatever, we think we're going to get away with it. And I suppose what we're being asked to take on is that all our unskillful actions will have unforeseen consequences. So we can't dodge this reality. It might be worth reflecting whether you've ever experienced something unforeseen and then gradually tracked it back to a particular tendency or action of your own. I think to track your experience and to track your own, well, the kind of ethical dimension of our behavior, that is to be a craftsman in the Dharma. And then we've got this line, stained with the non-clinging to myriad forms. In other words, non-attachment to all the many forms of the world and of our mind. I just want to say something about this nature of stained. I'm a textile designer, so I understand the process of staining and what would it be, dyeing fabric. So when you stain something, the color goes all the way into the text, all the way into the fabric, all the way into the leather. It goes through it, through and through, as it were. It can't be removed. So our protection in life, our mental states need to be stained or dyed all the way through with non-clinging. There's that lovely image after the Buddha gets enlightened and he's really not sure about whether to teach the Dharma because he thinks it's going to be too hard. And the reason he thinks it's going to be too hard, too difficult, is because he looks around the world and he sees people dyed in lust, stained in lust, stained in attachment. So it's the same image again. And also we use it to, well, we use it, for instance, in ordinations. There's often a lot of white associated with ordinations, and that's because you're trying to create a mind that is clear enough and receptive enough to take the stain and the dye of the Dharma. And that's what we're trying to do through study, you know, allow the mind to become receptive enough, like a piece of cloth, so that it can take the stain of the Dharma. And then you've got this image of the thread of devotion binding us to our ideals. We might have ideals, but we can't maintain our connection with them in our daily lives. So we need something that helps us maintain that vision, maintain a fidelity to our ideals. So what helps us do that? What helps us do that? Keep us in the samaya, you know, the commitment to our ideals in our life. Where do we get compromised? Where does our resolve get weakened? So yes, again, we can explore that in the group. So in the next part of the extract, the seminar extract, Bhante is saying, Milarepa's primary aim here is getting rid of ego clinging, but this should not be confused with a kind of feeble self-effacement. And then we get a whole section on positive pride or Buddha pride. So again, this is echoing Shantideva as well. So positive pride is unconnected with ego clinging and starts with an honest satisfaction with what we're doing. So we can feel good about what we're doing, we can feel satisfied, we can take pride in our attempts at spiritual life, in our attempts to communicate the Dharma. So positive pride is a quality of confidence. Whereas pride, in terms of arrogance or conceit, often shows a lack of confidence, interestingly. So in our study, in our discussion, it would be good to just distinguish between the two. In Know Your Mind, arrogance or mana is described as this. It is an inflated mind as to what is perishable, and its function is to serve as the basis for disrespect and frustrations. That's the Abhidharma. And Bhante says, mana is arrogance as distinct from pride, as in positive pride. There is a healthy pride that guards one from doing things of which one should be ashamed, and one can have a healthy confidence that one is capable of achieving worthy ends. But arrogance is an inflated idea of oneself in comparison with others. And we can get arrogant about our quality of humility as well. That is also listed. So you can take pride in the fact that you're not very proud. So again, just notice that. And in a way, as Dharma teachers, do we stand with pride in the Dharma? Or do we try and be humble in a very kind of artificial way and kind of minimize ourselves, or even minimize the Dharma in that respect? I think we can experience positive pride and confidence when we're serving a project that we feel proud about. And, you know, we want to do our best and we're in service to something that we really want to give to. And I've just been reflecting on how in the last few years, our tradition, our lineage and Sangharakshita and our movement generally, especially in the West, has come under quite a lot of criticism. So I wonder if we still feel we can take pride in our tradition, in our lineage. So that could be an interesting area to look at. Yeah, how do we maintain a quality of pride in our tradition, whilst also recognizing, you know, some things haven't been done well? Maybe it's a bit of a difference. Maybe it's like we're maturing a quality of confidence rather than being kind of intoxicated by something. So again, just an area to look at. And in the last paragraph of this section, Bhante says, the young man in the story has not been able to transform his worldly self-respect into genuine Buddha pride. So have a conversation about that in your discussion groups. What would that look like? What does it mean to move from a worldly self-respect to a genuine Buddha pride? What does that mean? So I think that's all I need to say right now. I know that Saddaloka wants to talk to us and just say a little bit about the verses of protection that he's read about and thought about from the Pali Canon.
It just comes across that traditionally there's a very strong connection between these, well, sutra and sutta, and ideas of blessings and protection. Blessings and protection often seem to go together in the Buddhist tradition. And the idea that certain suttas or scriptures actually bring protection, bring blessings, that the Dharma communicated through them actually protects us and blesses us. And you know, what does that mean? How are we protected by the Dharma? In Sri Lanka, there's a book of protection, a Piripota, a collection of Pali suttas that are recited to protect against harm and also bring well-being. So yes, just this whole idea of how the Dharma protects. I mean, it is understood in an almost magical way, I think, in some sort of folk Buddhism in some countries, traditional Buddhist countries. You know, yeah, just by reciting the Metta Sutta or the Mangala Sutta or the Ratana Sutta, one is going to be blessed and protected. But yeah, does this sort of folk understanding, is there a sort of actual living dharmic principle behind that, you know, that we are in a certain way actually protected by the Dharma? In the book of protection, they talk of protection by the power of truth, by the power of virtue, by the power of love, and by the power of sound. So, yeah, I don't really want to sort of come up with any answers. I was just really dropping in a few more thoughts around this idea of the Dharma protecting us and how that's actually a very strong current in the Buddhist tradition, and yeah, it's here again in this song of Milarepa. So just wanted to drop that in as well as something we might bring into our discussion. Yeah, that's